Where do you encounter your greatest disappointment, discouragement, maybe even depression? How do you deal with it? Where is and how would you describe your best life? It's one of the struggles that we all have, I think. We deal with those things day in, day out, sometimes for lengths of time, sometimes over issues that arise in our life. Sometimes it's just the emotions that we have kind of we're dealing with and struggling with. You know, as you think about it, you can divide it up into two main camps, and they're both reductionistic. And by that I mean, a lot of times we're trying to get it down to a simplistic answer. One is that you are just a machine. You are a system of chemicals that are put together, and if we can figure out your chemical problems, then we'll give you a pill and it'll take care of it. And sometimes we need those things. But a lot of times, that's the only thing that you need. Just take this and you're good. But on the other extreme of that is kind of a religious, spiritual thing. Maybe you're experiencing problems because you're not praying enough, or you're not doing your devotions, or you're mad at somebody and you need forgiveness, or God's mad at you, or if you could get those things right, then everything is going to be okay. But when we look at Scripture, and we look especially this morning in 1 Kings 19, we find that God does not approach our problems in a simplistic, reductionistic kind of means. Here's what I want you to remember this morning. God delivers you from discouragement through a deep encounter with grace. Let me read that again. God delivers you from discouragement through a deep encounter with grace. Over the next few weeks, we want to look at some of these life issues, some of the things that we're dealing with in culture. What does the Bible have to say? And I want to start here because I think this is one of those level grounds where all of us struggle with from time to time, some more than others, but it is part of who we are. And we want to find out, what does Scripture tell us? What does God tell us? How do we deal with these situations? And discouragement is one of those real significant problems. We're going to discover that if we can encounter God through a deep grace and understand what that is, it changes our perception and conception in our lives as well. Now, why does it matter that we look in the Bible? Why does it matter that we look at what God has to say? Well, God is not only our creator. We believe that. God made us, and therefore, since He made us, He knows how to fix us, to change us. Yesterday, I had a very simple example of that. We have one of those touchpad locks on our front door, which I love very much, and it's battery powered. And we hadn't changed batteries for 2 years, and all of a sudden a red light starts coming on. If you don't do this, you're not going to get in this house, kind of thing. And so I'm so mechanically inclined. I got my screwdriver out, and I found 3 screws, and I took those off. Then I started taking other screws out, and I said, I still don't see where these batteries are. And so I did what any good red-blooded American would do. I went to YouTube. And I wanted to see what the creator of this lock had to say. And it was a lot easier than I thought. He said, just pull this thing. Oh, there it is. That was it. Very simple. But I didn't know it because I didn't create that thing. In order to fix it, I had to go to the creator. And so when we look at God, we believe that God, being our creator, informs us on how we can better our lives. But also, not just as our creator, and we need to know this and really get this into our thoughts, into our hearts, but He is our loving, wise Father. And if He's our loving and wise Father, then what He is doing in our lives and what He is telling us to do with our lives is incredibly significant. Now I want to use this story in 1 Kings 19. It's one of my favorite ones. I've preached on it before, but I go back to it especially in this issue of discouragement and depression. And how do we deal with it? It's a story of Elijah. Now, in the previous chapters, Elijah is a prophet of God, and he's a mighty prophet of God in the northern kingdom. And historically, what has happened at this point is that Israel is divided into two kingdoms, the northern and the southern. And the northern kingdom strays away from God in a big way. They do their own thing, they have their own worship and their own kings. And each of their kings are bad. But one of the worst ones was a guy by the name of Ahab. And he had a wife by the name of, anybody know? Jezebel. See, you all knew the wives, but I was pretty good at that. Jezebel and Ahab were very, very evil. And God judged the land of the northern tribes of Israel. And for 3 years, they didn't have any rain. And Elijah had been hiding out. He'd been on the run. God had been protecting him, doing a number of things. And it finally says, it's time. Go and tell Ahab that time has come. And so what Elijah does, one of the greatest places in the Old Testament, he challenges the prophets of Baal, those false gods, prophets of Baal, to a challenge on a Mount Carmel. And he says, I'll tell you what, we're going to go up there and you're going to see if your God can do great things or my God will do great things. And so he puts a sacrifice up there and wood, and he says, now you tell your gods, Baal, to come and light the altar and do a great thing. And so they pray and nothing happens. And they dance around and nothing happens. They even start cutting themselves and doing all kinds of crazy stuff. Nothing happens. And then Elijah says, all right, boys, my turn. And he prays a prayer about 60 or 70 words. Fire comes down, burns up the wood, the stones, the sacrifice, everything. And then Elijah takes all of the prophets, I think there are 450 prophets of Baal, and he kills all of them. And he runs down the hill, and he actually pulls up his robe, and he runs past the chariot of Ahab, and he says, I'm going to beat you. And he goes to Jezreel, one of the prominent places of the land of the northern tribes. And he said, man, this is going to be great. Everything's going to be great. I have won. God has won. We're going to be in charge now. God has shown himself to be faithful. The prophets of Baal are done. Ahab is defeated. Everything is going to be great. Until we get to chapter 19. So let's start in verse 1. Ahab told Jezebel everything that Elijah had done and how he had killed all the prophets with a sword. So Jezebel sent a message to Elijah saying, may the gods punish me and do so severely if I don't make your life like the life of one of them, the dead prophets, by this time tomorrow. Then Elijah became afraid and immediately ran for his life. When he came to Beersheba, that belonged to Judah, he's gone to the southern tribes now, he left a servant there. But he went on a day's journey into the wilderness. He sat down under a broom tree and prayed that he might die. He said, I have had enough. Lord, take my life, for I am no better than my ancestors. Then he lay down and slept under the broom tree. He was at the top, everything was going well, and now he's at the bottom. It couldn't get any worse. Jezebel has said, if I don't kill you by tomorrow, may I die. And he runs and he takes off, and he is discouraged, despondent, and depressed. So what are the reasons? What are the causes? And maybe what, in applying it to ourselves, why do we get discouraged at times? Well, let me just give you a few of them as I look at Elijah's life. I think one of the things that caused his discouragement was success. Some of the times, what happens following success is we anticipate we will now be successful. Everything will go well. And so he had been successful on Mount Carmel. He says, hey, it's going to be great now. Life is going to be good. Everything is going to go the way that I had hoped it had always could go. That leads to a second thing, which is expectations. One of the worst things that can happen to us is expectations. Now, I don't mean to be a pessimist, and that's not what we're talking about, but sometimes our expectations are way beyond what God had planned for us to be. And so when our expectations meet reality, we become extremely discouraged. And then 3 F's: failure, fear, and fatigue. He feels that not only have I failed, but I myself am a failure. You know you're into discouragement when you pass beyond failure or failing and believe that you are now, as a result, a failure. And fear, it gets into him. He begins to be anxious. He doesn't know what to do. And then fatigue. And you know the old phrase, fatigue makes cowards of us all. And he had been on the run for so long, and he had been running all night, probably stayed up all day and all night, and now he's absolutely at the end. That's some of the causes. Well, how did Elijah handle it? How do you handle discouragement as well? Well, you all know the fight or flight symptoms that we have when we face something that takes us and scares us, makes us fearful. The adrenaline kicks in, and we either fight or flight. We run or we stand and we fight. It's kind of like if you see a lion outside today, I would suggest that you would run inside. That's a good thing. But if for the rest of the day and the rest of the week, you hide yourself behind a door because you're afraid that if you open the door or around the corner, there's going to be a lion there, that becomes anxiety. That becomes discouragement. That even becomes depression, where we don't know what to do and how to do it, and it's a constant adrenaline feed in your body. He also handled it by considering himself a complete failure. And if you notice, he says, I am no better than my fathers. Well, it's one of the most dangerous games that we play in discouragement. I do it all the time myself. And it's something that, God says, come on, Larry, get out of that. But that is comparing yourself to other people. Most of the time, when we're feeling bad about ourselves, don't we find someone who's doing better than us and say, see, they're doing better than we are. They were successful. People like them more than they like you. They're better looking, and in my case, they're taller than you. You know that. That's one of those things that we do. We become failure, and we begin to compare ourselves with other people. I want you to notice what else he does. This is where it becomes dangerous. He steps away from God. Did you notice in the passage that I read, he said that he left his servant at the border. When he crosses into Judah, he leaves his servant there. Now, understand something. Elijah is not a wealthy man. He's a preacher. He doesn't have much money. He doesn't have any means. He's been on the run. But he is a prophet. And as a prophet, he has a staff, you might say. A group of people. A servant that would help him along the way. But now he says, I don't need you anymore. Why does he say that? Because I am leaving the ministry. I am finished following after God. I am leaving the path that God has led me. I want to go on my own and do my own thing. And he lets his servant go. And then the final thing that he does, he wants to get rid of his own life. This is where he gets very desperate. Now notice he is not contemplating taking his own life. He's saying, God, take my life. I would just as soon be dead as anything else. That's the way sometimes we deal with those kinds of discouraging times in our lives. Do you see the progression? Do you experience that yourself at times? Well, let's see what God does. And it is fascinating how God deals with Elijah. Verse 5, chapter 19. Suddenly, an angel touched him. And the angel told him, get up and eat. Then he looked, and there in his hand was a loaf of bread baked over hot stones, and a jug of water. So he ate and drank and lay down again. Then the angel of the Lord returned a second time and touched him. He said, "Get up and eat, or the journey will be too much for you." And so he got up, ate and drank. Then on the strength from that food, he walked 40 days and 40 nights to Horeb, the mountain of God. He entered a cave there and spent the night. How did God deal with Elijah? Well, before I say that, let me point out what God didn't do with Elijah. If we were God, we might get and say, "Elijah, get over it. Suck it up. Come on, what's wrong with you, guy? You know this isn't as bad as you think it is," and we would have done something to get them going, but that's not what God does. He sends an angel. What's the very first thing that he does? Did you see it? Suddenly, an angel what? What's it say? Suddenly, an angel touched him. Did you get that? I hope you didn't pass that by. The angel touched him, put a hand on him. The very first thing that God does is he touches him through that angel. And then the next thing is he cooks for him. Now, I found this interesting as I started thinking about it a little bit, because it's very specific. It says that he, at his head there was a loaf of bread baked over hot stones. Now, God being God, could have said bread, and he had bread. Been no problem. But instead, here's the angel of God getting the stones hot, probably having a fire in there, and then baking the bread over the hot stones. God takes the time to bake. It smells. Can you know what it is when you're baking bread at home? It smells good, doesn't it? Doesn't it just kind of, man, not only am I hungry, but that I feel good. There's something about that. And there was that aroma inside that place where he was, and God bakes for him. He says, "You need to eat something. You need nourishment." You see, God doesn't just say you got a spiritual problem, you got a chemical problem, but you have a multiple problem. And we're going to look at it from different ways. You need me to be here and know that I will touch you. And I know you need something because you are tired. You need something for your body. You need something physically. And you also need sleep. That's why I don't wake you up while I'm preaching to you. I think that's important. Sometimes the most important time is that you get some rest right here. Hope not too much, but a little bit of rest. And he says, you need to sleep, and he lets him sleep. Sometimes when you're discouraged, you just need to get away. You need to get away to the lake, or you need to get away to the beach, or you just need to get away and you need to walk. You need to maybe be with somebody who loves you, and you need to go to a good restaurant, and you need to begin to breathe life again. And that's what happens in what's happening with God, and he deals with him. And then the last thing, look at it now. He says there's going to be a journey for you to Horeb, and he gives him a new direction. Not just any direction, though. He says to Mount Horeb. Now, you may not know what Mount Horeb is. It is another name that we know very well. It is Mount Sinai. This is Mount Sinai. You remember, this is the mountain of God, the mountain where Moses meets God. And he says, you're going to travel to the mountain of God. And so, now refreshed, ready to go, he's ready to take off. Now, notice that God is not trying to tell him what to do, tell him how he should feel or think. At this point, he's just simply allowing him to breathe deeply, eat, and rest, and then go to a new direction. And he says, I want you to go and enter into a cave in that place. Now, I hope you get this. Now, this is, I think, most commentators would agree with this, is what's happening. Is that there is a cave, and we call it a cleft in the rock. You remember who else was in a cleft in the rock? It was Moses. years before, Moses, when he went up into the Mount Sinai, he said, I want to see you, God. I want to see your presence. I want to see your glory. And God said, I'll do it a little bit. I will protect you by putting you in this cave, in this cleft in the rock. As I pass by you, you will see my glory. And so here we are. I think Elijah is understanding, I'm going to go to the mountain of God. I'm going to go to the place where Moses met God. I am going to meet with God as well. And so off he goes. And he takes off and he's there. Back to 1 Kings, verse 9. Suddenly, again the word suddenly. Suddenly, the word of the Lord came to him, and he said, what are you doing here, Elijah? And he replied, I've been very zealous for the Lord God of armies. But the Israelites have abandoned your covenant, torn down your altars, and killed your prophets with a sword. I alone am left, and they are looking for me to take my life. Then God said, kind of obtuse, he says, go out and stand on the mountain in the Lord's presence. Now, finally God speaks. And the first thing that God does is he speaks to him with a question. And he says, what are you doing here, Elijah? Now he's not saying, what are you doing here, Elijah? That's not how he's saying that. It's, what are you doing here, Elijah? You understand that whenever God asks a question, he doesn't ask it for information, right? When he comes to the Garden of Eden, he says, Adam, where are you? He's not saying, I can't find you. But every time that God asks a question, it is for the benefit of the person that he's asking. He's saying, do you know what you're doing? Do you know why you're here, Elijah? And so Elijah has a speech. I think he said, man, I've had 40 days to prepare this speech. And when God speaks, I'm going to tell him, listen, I've been very zealous for you, God. I did everything you asked me to do. You told me to go and do these things, and I did those things. And I stood up to the prophets of Baal, and I stood up against Ahab and Jezebel. And I did all these things, and we won the battle. And God, I've done everything, but you didn't quite fulfill your end of the bargain. Because look, nothing's changed. Remember, he goes to Jezreel. Why would he go to Jezreel, in the most obvious place in all of the northern kingdom? Because he thought that after Mount Carmel, everything would be different, and nothing was different. It was exactly the way that it was before he won that great victory. And he said, God, I did all these things, but they're going to tear down your altars, kill the prophets. They're looking after me. And God's response is not, but Elijah, it's not that. He says, what you need more than anything else, is you need to come and meet with me. Now, I don't know. I'm sure you're glad that I'm not God, because God might, if I were God, I would have gotten just a little impatient. Come on now, Elijah. I'm tired of you. Why are you doing it? But no, God says, come, let us meet together. Do you get that? In your discouragement, in your down times, it's easy for you to say, God just simply doesn't care about me. That's where you need that deep experience of the grace of God. And God constantly, continuously says, come, let's meet together. Verse 11. At that moment, the Lord passed by. A great and mighty wind was tearing at the mountains and was shattering cliffs before the Lord. But the Lord was not in the wind. After the wind, there was an earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. After the earthquake, there was a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire, there was a voice, a soft whisper, a still small voice. When Elijah heard it, he wrapped his face in his mantle, went out and stood at the entrance of the cave. Suddenly, a voice came to him and said, what are you doing here, Elijah? Now, as I read this, It hadn't occurred to me before, but I think this is what happens. God says, Elijah, come out here and let's meet. Let's talk. Come before my presence. And Elijah takes a step. And when he takes a step, he can't take any further step. Because as soon as he goes, it says, at that moment, the Lord passed by, and there was a great and mighty wind. We've all seen, especially last year, the hurricanes that went through our country, down in the southeast area. And I remember watching one time, there was a guy, and I mean the winds were like 140 miles an hour or something like that. He was walking and he couldn't possibly walk forward and blew it all the way back. That's hurricane force winds. That's what's going on up here. Elijah takes a step and immediately the rocks start falling off of the mountain because of the extreme winds that come. But that's not where God was. And then the earthquake comes. And things start moving around. And then the fire comes. All three of these things are part of God's power and judgment that you find in the Bible. Remember with Job, the whirlwind that came, that killed all his children and destroyed things. You remember Abraham with the fire that went down at the time of the covenant, or the fire with Moses and the burning bush, or Moses when he's on Mount Sinai, and the earthquake. All of these things show of the power and the judgment of God. And I can't help but think that Elijah was saying, you know, God, any one of these things, or all three of them, if you would send them Ahab and Jezebel's direction, then we would be finished with this thing. Because your power and your judgment, that's exactly what I want. That's what I need. That will make my life better. But in every one of these, it says, but the Lord was not in it. The power, the judgment of God is not what God wanted to display before Elijah. Here's the principle. God does not always act the way you think he should act. Can I say that again? God does not always act the way you think he should act. God, I think you want to do this, and if you do that, I'll be happy, I'll be great, it'll be wonderful. And it's not. God does not act the way that you think he should act. One of my favorite places in C.S. Lewis' The Chronicles of Narnia is where Aslan, the great, huge lion who's a representative of Jesus, is first seen by one of the children, and they're frightened, and they said, "Oh, that's a lion. Is he dangerous? Is he safe?" And one of the animals say, "Oh, he is not safe, but he is good." See, we want a safe God. We want somebody that we can predict. We want somebody that does the things that we want them to do. And if they'll fulfill our wishes, then our lives will be good. And God is saying, I'm not going to act that way necessarily. Because I want you to know that the power is in me, not in just what I do. And so he says, Elijah. I wonder what it says that he heard a voice, a still small voice. It doesn't tell us what that still small voice was. I kind of think that it was Elijah. You see what Elijah does? He is smart. He knows he takes his mantle, which is his robe, and he wraps it around his head. Why does he do that? He said, I don't want to peek out. Because if I see God, I'm a dead man. So he wraps it around his head. Can't you see him kind of moving out there like this? And he gets out there, and again, God says, Elijah, what are you doing here? I wish, these are one of those places that when I get to heaven, I want to go back and hear the audio and see the video. Don't you? Because I have a feeling that when God this last time, after all these manifestations of the power and the presence of God, and he's standing in front of God with his head wrapped with a mantle, and God's saying, what are you doing here? That this time he says the same words, but just a little differently, like, well, I've been very zealous for the Lord, and, things didn't work out real good, and I think he's backing away just a little bit. The reason I think that's the case is that he begins to hear the way that he's complaining before the Lord. He begins to experience the power of God and the powerlessness of himself, and the reliance upon God, not upon having it his way. Instead of God saying, well, now let me give you a good answer, here's what he does in verse 15. After this last time that Elijah says, I've been very zealous for the Lord, then the Lord said to him, go and return by the way you came to the wilderness of Damascus. And when you arrive, you are to anoint Hazael as king over Aram. You're to anoint Jehu, son of Nimshi, as king over Israel. Elisha, son of Shaphat, from Abel-Meholah, as prophet in your place. Then Jehu will put to death whoever escapes the sword of Hazael, and Elisha will put to death whoever escapes the sword of Jehu. But I will leave 7,000 in Israel, every knee that has not bowed to Baal, and every mouth that has not kissed him. And Elijah left there. You see, it's again how God answers is that Elijah provides the answers himself. I've been very zealous for the Lord, and I guess I'm only thinking one direction. I need to begin to get out of myself and look and see what you have for me. And God says, go back the way you came. Now, did you get that? Go back the way you came. Why is that significant? Well, he just came from places that were incredibly dangerous. That's why he's been on the run. That's why he's fearful. That's why he's afraid. And he says, here's what I want you to do. I want you to go further into the southern kingdom and find a safe place and stay there. That's not what he does. He says, I want you to go back the way you came. And I want you to depend upon me. I want you to begin to walk with me. The dangers are still there. But he says, I want you to know I am with you every step of the way. And then he says something very odd. If you don't know anything about the history of Israel, you probably miss it. But he says, I want you to anoint Hazael, and I want you to anoint Jehu, both as kings. Neither one of them are good guys. Hazael is not even Jewish. God is saying, I am going to use things that you do not know nor would anticipate to accomplish great things for my kingdom. Will you trust me in this? Even if it doesn't fit into your mold, will you follow what I ask you to do? And then he says, oh, by the way, I meant to tell you, Elijah, you're not alone. There's 7,000 other prophets that haven't bowed the knee or kissed the statue of Baal. They are just as prominent as you are in their faith. I don't know if I were Elijah, I would say, why did you tell me this earlier? Why didn't God tell him that earlier? Because he wanted him to depend upon God, not upon his circumstances. Will you trust me? That's the question that God, every time in our discouragement, he's saying, do you believe I'm here? Will you trust me? Now let me leave you with one sentence of application. Are you ready? Your best life is not found on the rock, but in the rock. Elijah, on Mount Carmel, when he was standing up very bravely, I mean, he was incredibly brave, is incredibly strong, all by himself, and he said, I'm going to show you who God is. And if you had asked him at that moment, is this your best life? He would say, are you kidding me? Of course it is. This is my best life. I'm on the rock. I'm showing everybody how powerful God is. This is my best life. I'm successful. Everything is going my way. Everything is going to happen as I knew it should. My best life is on full display. And we do the same thing. Sometimes we look and we say, if I have my finances in order, if my family is doing well, if the bills are being paid, if my health gets better, if all these things happen and line up as one, then it's my best life. Everything is good. There's nothing wrong with that life. Don't get me wrong. But that's not where your best life is found. It's found in the rock. Why? Well, go to Mount Sinai. And Elijah is in the rock. And where he is transformed is where he is protected as the Lord and his judgment passes by. And here's something that Elijah does not understand, but we do. Jesus is our what? Rock. Now I want you to look at the rock of Mount Sinai as he is in that cave, as the presence and the judgment of God goes by. The rocks are thrown around by the wind. They are shaken loose by the earthquake. They are burned by the fire. But Elijah is safe. And in Jesus Christ, as he goes to the cross and he dies for us, the judgment of God falls upon him. The fire of judgment, the earthquake of judgment, the wind of judgment comes all upon Jesus, and in the rock we are safe. We experience grace. Remember what I said earlier on? God delivers you from discouragement through a deep encounter with grace. The grace that you experience upon the cross, and you understand that God takes all the punishment in Jesus Christ, so that you and I, even though we experience loss, it is not ultimate loss. He experiences the hydrogen bomb of judgment, and we experience the high winds of struggle. There's no comparison. Listen, to the degree that you grow in your understanding and reliance upon this truth, that God really, really loves you, and that he's always with you through every wind, earthquake, and fire, that Jesus has got you, to that degree, you will live your best life. We so often say, the circumstances of my life are revealing to me that Jesus is not really loving me, that God really doesn't love me, and we are missing the cross. We're living on the rock. We're not living in the rock. We've got an old hymn that says this: when darkness seems to hide his face, I rest in his unchanging what? Grace. Here's the assignment this week. I'll put it up on the webpage this week, this verse. I used it this week in my prayer time. I like to pray through the Psalms. And I would love for you to take this in your Bible or write it out and put it in your on your mirror or in your car or wherever, because you are going to combat discouragement and depression all of your life. It's where it is. We live that. It's part of the fears and the struggles of our lives. Psalm 43:3 says, send your light and your truth. Let them lead me. Let them bring me to your holy mountain, to your dwelling place. That's Jesus. Then I will come to the altar of God. That's the cross. To God, my greatest joy. I will praise you with the lyre. God, my God. That's worship. Why, my soul, are you so dejected? Why are you in such turmoil? Put your hope in God, for I will still praise him, my Savior and my God. That is where we must be. And to the degree that we place that in our lives, in our thoughts, as we work it through our circumstances, we begin to live our best life. Derek, I'm going to ask you to come as we have our invitation and end our time together. There's not a one of us, if your conscience that from time to time do not struggle. Sometimes the struggles are mighty. Sometimes they're just kind of piddly. Sometimes they're circumstance-based. Sometimes they're within our lives and who we are. And we need more help than we can just with a good word. But I got to tell you, as the more we experience the deep work of grace, the more peace, strength we experience together. Let's stand together, shall we? We're going to end by singing that song, Lord, I Need You. Oh, I need you. Derek will lead you, so teach my heart to sing to you.
So teach my song to rise to you. When temptation comes my way, and when I cannot stand, I'll fall on you. And Jesus, you're my hope and stay. And when I cannot stand, I'll fall on you. Jesus, you're my hope and stay.
Sing this out together now.
Lord, I need you. I need you. Every hour I need you. My one defense, my righteousness. Oh God, how I need you. Lord, I need you. Oh, I need you. Every hour I need you. My one defense, my righteousness. Oh God, how I need you. My one defense, my righteousness. Oh God, how I need you.
Experience the deep grace of God this week. Bill, Greg, would you dismiss us in prayer?